Well, George Galloway MP is here. Congratulations.
Thank you.
You going to be any more conscientious representing the people of Bradford than you were in Bethnal Green?
Oh, don't start by insulting me now. Let's not go
well,
off
it's true. Come on.
Let's not get off on
there's a more serious point here
bad
because
start.
You only attended 8% of votes during your time there.
Well, as I've explained to you and others many times before, in the Commons you can only vote for the government's motion or the Leader of the Opposition's amendment. And I seldom wished to vote for either in that 5 years. My attendance in Parliament was daily. My attendance in votes depended on what the issue under discussion was. But you know what, Jeremy? I won. You're going to have to get used to that.
Oh,
I won a great victory.
I've already congratulated you.
Well, yes, but not sincerely, evidently.
No, quite sincerely.
No,
it is. I said it was
sincerely.
One of the most epic victories in recent electoral
maybe
history.
The best answer I can give you then is evidently the people of Bradford West think so, because they voted for me in overwhelming number.
Well, I'm quite struck by the phrase that you used. We heard it there, the Bradford Spring. It just struck me as an odd form of words for a man who described President Assad's Syria as the last castle of Arab dignity.
Please don't think that I'm on trial in front of you, Jeremy. You're not fit to be my judge. The people
I'm
of
not
Bradford
judging you,
West,
I'm just thinking it's a very odd form of words.
Well, evidently the people of Bradford West, who frankly matter to me far more than you do, are the judge of what I say and what I do. And they judged in a democratic election, 18,000 of them, to put their X next to my name. So they evidently were not put off by your misrepresentations of my views about Syria.
You did. I've seen the email. You did describe Assad's Syria as the last castle of Arab dignity.
I did in 2005 and
2010, in fact.
No, it wasn't in 2010.
It was the 14th of August, 2010.
No, my speech in Syria was in 2005.
No, we're talking about an email, not your speech. When you talked about what a good chap Assad was. I'm talking about the email you sent.
Let me tell, well, that was at the time he was sleeping in Buckingham Palace in the Queen's spare bedroom.
He wasn't sleeping in Buckingham Palace in August 2010.
The Syrian people are the last castle of Arab dignity. They are the last castle of resistance to Israeli occupation and to imperialist intrigue in the area. But I don't think that was an issue in the Bradford West by-election.
But why did you talk about the Bradford Spring?
Please accept that a big uprising of people, peaceful, democratic uprising, unknown, unnoticed by you, you didn't send anyone there, the London media didn't send anyone there, and yet it happened, has to be characterized as something new in British politics. They were not voting on my views about Syria, neither on my views about how to vote in House of Commons divisions, which are largely meaningless to most of them, which is what this discussion really should be about.
We're going to get on to that. I just want to get one other point with you, which was this. Why did you say God knows who is a Muslim and he knows who is not? I, George Galloway, don't drink alcohol. I never have. I, George Galloway, have fought for Muslims at home and abroad all of my life. Now, why
wouldn't I say that?
Well, I'm just interested as to why you found it necessary to say it.
Because the Labour candidate was going around campaigning on the twin bases that he was a Pakistani and a Muslim. So I believed that shameless playing of ethnicity as an electoral card was something that needed to be answered. And ordinarily, of course, if it were me that were being accused of it, you'd be the sternest critic. Well, people shouldn't vote for
I've never had anyone ask for my vote by telling me how much they drink, that's all. I was just curious.
Well, I mean, I don't drink, and he does.
All right, let's talk a little bit about what this victory for George Galloway, it is a sensational result. Let's talk about what it represents. Ed Miliband was talking to you about how your party needs to listen. Why didn't you realise that before?
I think he's always spoken about that. It was a sensational result, and I think, to be honest, Jeremy, you do a disservice to people of Bradford West by focusing on George. Does George drink? What George said about the people, you know,
in what he chose to say.
In a democracy, you have to listen when people vote in those numbers, and clearly the people of Bradford West, they were trying to get a message through to the political establishment. And I think the underlying message, it's not just issues about Afghanistan, although whether you live in Bradford or Tunbridge Wells, you wonder what on earth we're still doing in Afghanistan 10 years after the beginning. There is an issue, though, about the huge economic gap between North and South, and it's a mistake to write off Bradford West, as some people do. We need to listen to that message.
Well, Self, but at a broader level, what is going on, do you think, in people's attitudes to the mainstream parties?
Well, they're falling away from them. I mean, we've got consistently lower attendances. The attempts of both the Tories and Labour to launch themselves in some sense as mass membership parties has largely been a failure. And I think that the kind of tit-for-tat business of politics, you know, the Liberals came into the last election on the face of it with an honest desire to try and change that and to try and introduce a more proportional...
It fooled you.
It fooled me.
Well, you know, yes, it fooled me, and in a sense I didn't think that they'd be so feeble when it got to the negotiating procedure. I thought as a party that understood how proportional government worked, they might have been prepared to sit down a bit longer.
The point is it's over for the Lib Dems. But, you know, I must say this, that every time there's a sensational by-election, going all the way back to Eric Lubbock and Orpington, people say this is the end of politics as we know it. But funnily enough,
no one's saying it's the end of politics. But have you, do you notice it in the Conservative Party as well?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, this has been a wake-up call, I think, for all the political parties. And it may well be that a future by-election, even in this Parliament, that the Conservatives may have big problems. And I think part of the issue, actually, is the way we do politics. Everything is focused on the marginal seats. So what happened in Bradford, and what was interesting was, I don't think Labour had any idea of any data about where the voting preferences were, so that come the close of polls, they'd sort of assumed, oh, we've won again like we've won for the last 40 years. And that's why it was such a shock, I think, to the Labour Party.
So did Tory polling predict that George Galloway was going to win?
No, it didn't. But again,
you were all caught on the hop.
We all were. And sorry, I'm not trying to make an anti-Labour point. I'm making a point that the whole focus now of politics is on the 80 to 100 marginal seats where everything matters, all the resource goes in.
And I think that's true.
The relatively small armies of members that all the parties now have are working in that.
What's your solution?
I don't think there are easy solutions to it. And the reality, I'm afraid, is, and this is one of the difficulties, I think that there was great excitement when the coalition came in 2 years ago about a new, fresh politics.
No, there wasn't.
Well, in fact, I think from some people there was, George.
I detected none of that, I must say.
Well, I was perhaps still in the House at the time. But I think
you need to get out more.
Part of the problem, I think, now is that essentially we have got probably diminished living standards in this country for the next decade. And it is going to be incredibly difficult. No government of whatever stripe is going to be popular, and no opposition is going to be trusted, not least because we may well be in a situation rather like the 1960s and 70s, where we will be chopping and changing at each and every election going forward. And that, I think, that is going to be the main problem we're going to face.
But isn't the point about Bradford, you know, George was campaigning, when you were campaigning, you were saying there's this Bradry system among certain Urdu people in the Labour Party in Bradford. There's a system essentially of patronage. It's good old Tammany-style politics. And in a way, there's a Bradry system operating at a national level as well. The political class offers sinecures. In a way, it's viewed as a closed loop. It doesn't matter.
It's a parallel.
George Galloway.
It's a parallel universe, Jeremy. I mean, Mark is a gentleman and an expensively educated one, but frankly, he might be from Mars to the streets of Manningham. There, youth unemployment has risen 40% in 12 weeks and tripled in a year. The mass of the people are in absolute poverty in British terms. Not relative to other countries in the world, but in British terms, mass poverty. And these politicians, not Diane, but the political leaders speak in a different language to them and about different things to them.
It's a rather beautiful inverted world, isn't it, Bradford, George? You've got an enormous hole in the middle of your city where there's a Westfield meant to be, unlike the enormous Westfield on Stratford Marshes and catering to the Olympics.
These are parts of the country that have never recovered from the deindustrialisation of the Thatcher years.
That's right.
And now the coalition is slashing public sector spending. No wonder there's no hope.
But you see, the interesting thing about George, whatever, even his critics will acknowledge that George Galloway gave people who voted for him something to hope for. Let's hope.
Well, I'm afraid I think rather misguidedly. I mean,
perhaps.
It's in George's problem and Respect's problem in general, and they're in a coalition with some rather unlikely fellow travellers who don't necessarily even want to travel with George.
Well, it sounds like the Lib Dems and the Tories.
Namely the SWP, but all of these groups, to some extent, demand representation and represent a part of the vote, and we don't have an electoral system that is capable of reflecting that level of diversity.
Yeah.
And all due respect, no pun intended to George, but what he had in Bradford was a synergy between the conditions he describes, the economic and social conditions, and a particular local disaffection on two issues: British foreign policy, because of the ethnicity of the vote, and a disaffection with the local Labour Party.
No, first of all, it's not
and
just, it's not just Muslims that think we should come out of Afghanistan. It's not just Muslims who were very disillusioned by the Iraq
Professor
War.
Self, of course, is
Professor Self,
a distinguished figure of academia, so you'll want to hear this. The University Ward of Bradford West, which, as the name suggests, is as plural ethnically and in other senses as it can be, I want 85% of that vote. And I want it because your friends in the Liberal Democrats absolutely betrayed the university community and the student community, who from this September will be paying £9,000 a year in tuition fees. That was not a Muslim issue. That was a young person's issue.
Yeah, but
there was a
how are you
poverty
going
issue.
to reverse that?
I'm not going to reverse it, but I'm going to speak for them.
Yes.
I'm going to speak out, and as has happened already, I am heard when I speak. People are paying attention to what I'm saying because of this result.
Yes, but essentially you'll be sideswiping actual parliamentary politics. You're a lone MP in
all
a
right,
sense.
okay, let's leave that. But that question that George Galloway raises of how the Liberal Democrats behaved in making a very, very public pledge, which on getting into the first sniff of power for decades, they immediately renege upon.
I couldn't
that
agree
has
more.
destroyed a tremendous amount of trust in mainstream politics.
Very disillusioning.
Absolutely,
for
it's a
people.
political
Very
seppuku. I mean,
You backed them, didn't you?
He bought
well,
it.
I voted for them. I wouldn't say I backed for them.
Gullible Professor Self.
Who'd have
Gullible.
thought it?
Sad, but
Actually, the Liberals,
who
are
else
headed for
was
the
I going to
knacker's
vote
yard.
for?
That's the word on the street. They really are headed
Well,
for the
possibly.
knacker's
We'll
yard.
have to wait and see. But
It's over.
I wonder if this sort of behaviour is the consequence of coalition. What happens when you have coalition governments?
No, I think there is an element of that. We're not used to coalitions in this country. The notion that after an election that essentially a coalition agreement is reached, which is like a sort of tablet of stone compared to the manifestos that were put to the public at large. And that is a problem. And I think it is going to cause a certain amount of disillusionment. There is this whole sense, as you say, that there's no legitimate mandate for quite a lot of what is going on. But a lot of that, of course, again, is driven by the economic situation, which, again, none of the political parties, Labour, Liberal or the Conservatives, levelled with the public before the last election about how serious it was. We were dancing on the edge of a pin saying it's all about £6 million was the difference between Armageddon and sunlit uplands. And I mean, there were some of us who did actually say at the time, listen, this is not the way to go about it. But
it's
there's a
also
sense we drew a line after the election.
disillusion has been, perhaps not disillusion, but the fact that the voter has become more promiscuous, more volatile, more changeable, as something that's been going on for 40 or 50 years, isn't it?
Well, the irony probably is that, funnily
that?
enough, in the next election, there's been this diminution in the vote for the two main parties, Conservative and Labour Party. Probably it will actually go up slightly in the next general election because of the collapse, what one assumes to a certain extent, of the Liberal Democrat vote going forward. But I don't disagree with what you're saying. And I think the clip earlier on was very, very interesting, because actually what you have is a lot of small single-issue protest groups who basically are very targeted and they deliver, and the feeling is the political class just makes a lot of promises every time, and partly because of global factors and the power of international business.
You can also take your
deliver.
concerns elsewhere, can't you? You can take your concerns to a charity, you can tweet, you can
You saw that 38 Degrees. If they really have 1 million members, that's hundreds of thousands more than any of the political parties here.
But hang on a minute.
The Stop the War Coalition moved millions of people in the run-up to the Iraq War. People are in CND, they're in all sorts of
George,
things.
you know
They
as
no
well as I
longer
do.
trust parties.
But it's not one or the other. It is not single-issue pressure groups or political parties. They work together.
None
That's
of this
the point.
actually feeds into legislation. You can be as mean as you like about the Lib Dems, and the reality of it is that actually if you're a Lib Dem party member, in theory, you have a say in what goes into the manifesto and becomes. So that's why the Lib Dem betrayal looks so bad. On the other hand, if you're a member of the Tory party, you can suddenly wake up to find a government introducing a piece of legislation legislation like the reorganisation of the National Health that you had no part in,
Yeah, but they
and you didn't even necessarily
they also cut
vote
the top
for.
rate of tax, and
Yeah.
Tories are very happy about that.
So, you know, the
hey.
actual disconnect between being a member of the Tory party and a Tory government is, you know, necessarily could be perceived
Well,
as
but
greater.
as you say,
No,
we're a less democratic party in that sense, in the sense that we've always taken the view that we
No, but-
get on, let the we
But
want to
what
get
you
into
want
government
to
and
do
then let the team get on and do it.
unless you want everything to disappear in this kind of gloop of civic mindedness and vague internet petitions, what you want is people to be keyed into the business of making legislation, to feel that they have a stake with
Well,
legislation.
It's not
But
fair
here's
to
the
say the
interesting
Tories
thing.
haven't delivered for Tory voters, cutting tax, cutting the public sector, putting up the price of pasties. Of course they've delivered for key Tory voters.
But Dan, to be serious, I mean,
I'm being
there is
serious.
there's actually
This is a
there's a longer
Tory
term issue, I
government,
think, about
a Tory-led government.
Kept in power by the Liberal Democrats.
Indeed.
There's a longer term issue, I think, about whether we have a distinction between the executive on the one hand and legislators. And members of Parliament are legislators to be voting on the not being whipped through in quite the same way. Now, that's a fair way ahead, I suspect.
Let George Galloway have the last word. Go on.
Well, I think Will's actually on to the real point, that there's a paradigm shift, that the system has failed, that the Tweedledee, Tweedledum, Tweedledee and a half, if a backside could have three cheeks, they're sitting in the House of Commons
The number of times
across
you've
each
heard
other in fake opposition, but they all stand for the same things: neoliberal economics, cuts in public expenditure, and war abroad. That paradigm has to be smashed open,
All
and
right.
I hope that started on Thursday.
Okay, thank you all very much. Thank you. Now, it always used to be said that whatever you thought of individuals